Hello, everyone. This is Brian Germain, and this is Casual Chat. I have Chloe from Alta Psychotherapy here to have a really cool discussion about a lot of different things. So I can do a little bit of intro, but the truth is, I think you could probably introduce yourself a whole lot better. Chloe's a highly experienced skydiver and also a helper, a light worker, somebody that's out there trying to uplift spirits and get people into a more positive perspective in their life. So maybe you can tell us a little bit about yourself and a little bit about Alta.
Yeah, so this is actually my practice. This is the background that most clients see, unless I'm in New York and they see a slightly different background as well. My name is Chloe Svolakos. Most people, I think, know me as Chloe Callow, just because I think it was easier to put that on Burble. But I am a licensed clinical social worker. I have been for the past, I want to say 3 years, but I've been to licensed master social worker for about 6 or 7, and I've been doing clinical work since 2008, mainly 2009. So I have a lot of experience working with individuals, men and women, in trauma, and really understanding the connection between the body and the mind when it comes to having sustained trauma and kind of living post a traumatic incident or a series of traumatic incidents, whether that be childhood or whether that's an acute experience that someone goes through. So I have these kinds of conversations where it's not just about speaking about the one incident, but rather how it connects to the rest of someone's life, and also the other experiences that have come before an incident, an accident, for our purposes in sport, and what it drudges up. And I think that it's really and important work and careful work. I've seen a lot of different kinds of things in terms of like life coaching and different approaches, I would say, but this is a an evidence-based clinical model where I use different modalities that are proven psychologically from years of knowledge about how we function mentally, physically, emotionally, and even spiritually, that these modalities are proven to work and to help people.
Yeah, got it. Yeah, with the topic of trauma, there's some people that know that they're in that category. They know they have work to do because it's in their face.
Mhm.
And I think there's also a much larger circle of people who actually are pretty traumatized by one thing or another, and they just don't quite accept that they got work to do.
Mhm.
Have
Mhm.
you found that to be true?
I found many different experiences to be true. That is certainly one of them. And the other reality is that there is a disconnect because when we have to survive um, repeatedly through circumstances that ask us to preoccupy ourselves towards, survival methods, a lot of our creativity, a lot of our connectivity on a medical level as well also
Mhm.
become removed. We become disconnected.
Yeah.
And also the narratives that we received in development in our childhoods, if we come from a traumatic place, I think I know what happens is the narratives, whether they're directly told to the child, or they're understood by the child, understood by us as children,
Mhm.
just by way of being treated in a particular way and the messages that we receive. We develop a sense of self that almost it sets you up for not being able to connect and to understand yourself because of emotional neglect, or a preoccupied parent, or volatility. Like all of these kinds of circumstances really teach somebody, rather than not to think about themselves, but rather that they don't have a self.
Right.
They show up either for others, or they show up to survive through any scenario. And so, there's a lot of overlap with child development, and sometimes the incidents or accidents that happen in skydiving or base jumping or any kind of sport that, like I said before, drudges up some of these belief systems in how we care for ourselves, don't care for ourselves. We don't always know that we're not doing it. We don't know. If you're not taught that, then you're not really connected to the fact that that even exists, that that's an option.
Sure. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. I'm noticing, because I've of course work with people in a similar way in my own modalities, that we have a perspective that naturally shifts our identity to feel sane, to
Mm-hmm.
feel like I'm okay, I'm okay. And not
Mm-hmm.
everybody's okay. And the truth is
Mm-hmm.
everybody's got a part of us that's not okay, the healing parts, everybody.
Mm-hmm.
I
Mm-hmm.
deeply believe that. And you could call it denial, or I don't know what the word,
Numbness, you can call it numbness.
numbness. And we convince ourselves that we're okay, we're good, we don't need any more. And when in fact we still hurt, we're
Mm-hmm.
still having those instant reactions that maybe it's not such a hot aversion, like a hot fear or something like that, where it physiologically escalates you, but we take a wide berth around
Mm-hmm.
circumstances where our lives get smaller as a result. That's my observation.
Yeah. I mean, these words have become more popularized, I think, recently, especially after COVID, I think. There's been this movement of people that are tired of the stigmatization of mental health and receiving help. And
Yeah.
from that, I think has stemmed the popularization of the word trauma and healing. We hear it everywhere. And not everything that is difficult is necessarily traumatic. But the interesting thing is that in doing this work, what is traumatic is not recognized as trauma. It's
Mm.
not recognized as an injury. So on Instagram, for example, or I don't know, I don't necessarily have TikTok. I was thinking about maybe making one so that way, because I think that,
Good.
people have garnered a lot of success with it. I have no
Yeah.
idea. I'm a dinosaur, but with social media in general, there's just a lot of discourse and a lot of open discourse about calling things trauma. And I think that that's really important.
Maybe a
Um,
definition. Maybe a definition. Of course, it's your
yeah,
definition, in terms.
sure, sure. Um, there this idea is not my own. I think it's anyone who I think really does deep trauma work on a psychotherapeutic level might have the same or similar ideologies as I do. So I don't think that it's a unique idea. I think that the approach of viewing trauma as not the thing that happened to you, but rather the aftermath, the injury that happens after the the event or the moment in time that caused chaos,
Mhm.
um, is really what trauma is, right? Because certain things can happen in your life, and they can be traumatic, but they're not necessarily seen as trauma, and that's pretty empowering. And the reason it's empowering is because if we were to see trauma as the thing that happened in 1997,
Mhm.
you would never be able to go back to 1997, or for younger listeners, like 2003. Again, I feel like a dinosaur.
Yep.
But you would never be able to go back in time and actually do anything about it.
Yeah.
And a lot of people live this way with identification that the thing that happened to me is part of me, it is me, and that is how I walk with that part of me, and that understanding that because I've been traumatized, or because I have I I I have learned, not necessarily fact, but because my thoughts have been so vivid, I have learned or developed a sense of myself in this way, and it's difficult to break because I know no other way. You would never be able to undo that,
Yep. Yep.
you know? So the hope is that when we reconceptualize what trauma is, you're able to actually do that today. You're able to work towards healing today. And there goes another word that I think
Mhm.
is a deep word. It's something that is a complicated word. We need to complicate it,
Mhm.
because it has a high we societally, I think, have a high expectation of healing. and everything is popularized as healing nowadays. And you really have to ask yourself, what exactly does that mean on a therapeutic level,
Mm-hmm.
in a therapeutic space? I, as a clinician, I think have to, constantly evaluate what healing means for each client on their own journey subjectively.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and and yeah, so there's hope when you understand that you might have sustained an injury, but just like skin, it our skin cells, when you look them under a microscope, they actually work like threads and they start threading themselves back together. There might be some scarring there. The other additional piece that I want to mention is that when it comes to trauma, time doesn't heal.
Mm.
So
Yeah.
if you have this expectation that you're going to wait 1 or 2 years, and because so much time has passed, then you should be fine, that doesn't work like that, because the injury, if it's unaddressed, if there really is no true healing,
Yeah.
the recycling, healing being my definition, I guess, is the recycling of pain into something good, into something productive, constructive, whether that be a wisdom or more boundaries created or a safety plan, things in place by way of what you've experienced, that the resilience that needs to happen, the wisdom and the growth that needs to happen,
Mm-hmm.
and the separation of this identification that I am a wounded person and things have happened, so therefore I am this,
Right.
that separation, so that you actually recover yourself. And recover means to find yourself again, and
Mm-hmm.
that takes a lot of time and real breakdown of conversation, and
Yeah.
so that's why I think evidence-based practice methodology is really important here, because there is evidence to suggest that, be it a medical or a psychological and neurological level, we respond to fight and flight and difficult moments very animalistically. Our limbic system and our sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous systems are, um, we constantly are tasked to balance it all out. And so a lot of the work that I do is educational first.
Mm-hmm.
So we create that framework for people.
Yeah. Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah. So they can alchemize. As you were talking, that word really showed up for me, is that you're taking an experience that could be construed in one way or
Mhm.
another, either
Mhm.
something that built me up or broke me down.
Absolutely.
And if
Absolutely.
and if I interpreted it in a certain way and learn the lesson that is positive instead of learn the lesson that is negative.
Mhm.
Uh,
And you brought up something so important. Um, and I don't know if I have any clients that are listening, but they're gonna be like, yeah, okay. So I speak about positive and negative all the time, because I think we live in a society that is telling us that, I work with the feelings wheel a lot. And for those who don't know what that is, it's a graphic that has a bunch of different feelings, and they're all categorized in
mm,
certain ways. They're color coded, and so we use this tool, but I use it in a very particular way. There really is no other model outside of, I had to create something in order for my clients to have their, uh, I don't know, I think their own process, but we needed a tool that they would be able to use every single day. So I took this feelings wheel, and now we have a methodology around how to use it.
mhm.
But one of the first things that I ask my clients are to look at the feelings wheel and tell me what they actually see, because it's split between what most people would call negative and positive emotions.
Mhm.
And that's so interesting, because when we're thinking about biofeedback, and we are in attempts to open up a space so that way you have instruments, as you would on an airplane, to be able to gauge what you're experiencing,
Mhm.
nothing is inherently negative. It might actually, in the literal empirical sense, like in research methodology, right? Like it might take away, but
Yeah.
I actually think that even what we think of as negative emotions is actually giving us a lot,
Yes,
right?
I agree
So if you
completely.
take those words, you scatter them all up, there's, you're not scaling them in relation to good, bad, negative, and positive. They're just information,
Right.
which I
The
think is
aver-
really important. It's a distinction to make.
yeah, the aversion to what we would call, negative affect, things that don't feel good at the time,
Mhm.
that creates sort of a complex behind us.
Right.
We're not paying attention to it, but we need to get angry, for instance, about something.
Right. right.
sometimes that is the positive emotion out of the stuckness of
That's right.
helplessness.
Hmm.
And I think
Right.
it's vital that we go into complete acceptance of how
Hmm.
we actually feel right
Hmm.
now.
Right. 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 Rather than I am causing problems, I am being problematic, which I think is a message that we receive a lot.
Mm,
And it only fuels this avoidant and suppressed issue that we have
yeah.
in the community that we belong to, right? Skydiving inherently, base jumping.
Hmm.
I mean, a lot of these sports, and I speak specifically just because, we're speaking to skydivers, but a lot of my clients are, whether that's, oceanic sports, aviation-based
Hmm.
sports,
Yeah.
mountaineering,
Yeah.
anything else, right? A lot of this, we're feeling adrenaline, we're feeling cortisol, and those can be for some people very familiar
Hmm.
processes, biological processes, and also familiar feelings, emotions, thoughts, a way of being, right? And inherently it can be avoidant. And so
Hmm.
when you look back on someone's childhood, someone I really like following a lot, I love his books, I love his reading. I don't know if he was a pediatrician. Man, I'm embarrassed because we're recording, and I don't want, respectfully, I don't want to get this wrong, but
Hmm.
regardless, he was a physician.
Hmm.
His name is Gabor Mate, and for anyone listening, I really think that it's just a recommendation to just go down that route. Our work is very much aligned as a lot of people who do this kind of trauma work.
Hmm.
Um, our sentiments and our thoughts around this work are very similar. But when you look at child development and you
Hmm.
look at the messages that a kid receives, right? They're angry, right? I think he talks about not getting the cookie or something, or stealing a cookie. And then mom gets upset and like, why did you do that? Go to your room or whatever.
Hmm.
Um, or a child goes to a preoccupied, emotionally distant or busy lifed parent, right?
Right.
And
Yep.
wanting attention
Hmm.
and wanting to show them, something. Hey, mom, look what I did, and really having that need,
Hmm.
right? The moment that that child interacts with the parent, and that parent says, basically, the message is, you have a need, but to have a need with the way that I'm responding to you is a problem. It's something that I don't want to attend to because you have interrupted whatever I'm going through,
Right.
right?
Right. That's
We learn
huge.
that from such a young age. So that's why I think it's problematic to call anything negative. And
And we have to learn it,
yeah.
because the truth is that when you come up with an idea or something you want to communicate in your own timeline, your own
Mhm.
separate time construct, we have to learn how to fit it in with the flow of conversation, with the flow of events, because quite frankly, sometimes I have a communication with my kids. It's like, guys, I'm landing the airplane. I might not be landing the airplane, but they know what I mean is hold your thought. And I know you're afraid of forgetting what you were going to say. I know, because I feel it myself sometimes when I
Mhm.
come up with something I want to share. But
Mhm.
the answer is yes, but not yet.
Mhm.
We all have
Yeah.
to learn that. That's not easy, but how do I do that? That's the question. How does one do that in a way that's respectful? That's not saying I'm not interested. I'm not saying that at all. I'm saying I want to hear what you have to say.
Yeah.
However, I can't do it right now because I'm cutting something sharp with a big knife or
Right.
something.
Right. But you are still holding presence for knowing that your child has a need.
Yeah.
So there are parents that, um, because they haven't attended to their own subconscious pain,
Mm,
their older pain, they are not aware, they haven't worked on their own awareness of what their own children are bringing up for them.
yep.
They're living lives that are cyclically engaging in the same kind of pain patterns,
Hmm.
or they might have morphed a
Yeah.
little bit, but maybe they're also struggling because they have, two jobs, or they, for whatever reason, when you have a parent that is also in emotional pain, maybe unaware or not, that then unfortunately, I mean, the fortunate thing is that there's space to be able to heal from it later, but unfortunately becomes the burden of, that child later on in life having to be the one to figure out how to heal that.
Right.
Right.
Right. Right.
And when you then have that person grow up and then engage in something like skydiving or engage in something like base jumping, where you really do have yourself to rely on, that
Mm.
can bring up a lot.
Yep.
It can bring up a lot in that person, which is an
Absolutely.
excellent place as long as that individual is aware enough to know that there's an opportunity there that's presenting themselves so that they can actually meet themselves a little bit more. Because why do we get into skydiving? Unless you're like a second or third generation and it's kind of normative because it runs in your family, it's just the same thing as, anything else that gets passed along.
Mhm.
Um, Most people get into skydiving to do something for themselves.
Mm.
They might not recognize exactly why, but maybe it's to build confidence, maybe because they want to build themselves, maybe because they have a conceptualization of their future self. And that's actually how they're living. They're not really living presently, but they're living with the desire to kind of hamster wheel, get over to that thing that when I get there and I
Yeah.
look this way and I live this way, I'll be okay.
Yeah.
We do everything we do, even addictions, right? Anything that we're doing is,
Mhm.
whether it's adaptive or maladaptive or healthy, unhealthy, um, to help ourselves, to try to solve a problem,
Yeah.
right?
Absolutely. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of the problems we're trying to solve started a long, long time ago.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
In it's something that I was taught, a Buddhist principle that there is pain, right? Physical pain. I can, pain in your shoulder or something. And then there's the pain of pain, in the salient moment when it's really intense, it's, you're just focused on the pain. But even so, there's still this layer of what I can't do now. And, the sort of the shame maybe of getting hurt, a skydiver has a bad landing, and then there's this other layer of it. And that's
Mm-hmm.
the part that echoes. And I
Mm-hmm.
feel like trauma is the echo that
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
continues, and it rings in our ears like a tinnitus that we just can't shake.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's the work, isn't it? Is
Mm-hmm.
finding ways to see similar circumstances differently than the patterns that we've created, the responses of retraction and
Mm-hmm.
avoidance and
Mm-hmm.
the overreaction in some cases.
Yeah, I would love to have um people recognize in our community, and I mean, all these kinds of, just the extreme sports community, I think in general, or adventure sports, alternative sports. They're all so individualistic. I mean, you're out there by yourself learning something. Yeah, you're with people, but it really is about the internal processes,
Mhm.
plural.
Yeah.
And it's such a special place
Mhm.
to gain a lot of material about what's coming up.
Yeah.
And I think that extreme sports and people who partake in any of the activities have a lot to say and teach other people, actually,
Mhm.
because we have, and here's an interesting thought, because I don't necessarily, I can't generalize and say and blanket this statement, because I actually don't think that this is true for everybody.
Mhm.
But for those of us who walk cognizantly uh, about mortality, living and dying,
Mhm.
also being alive in the
Yes.
moment,
Yep. Yep.
right? If you
Yeah.
stay in the sport long enough, you are bound to,
Yep.
lose people. You're bound to also experience injury. And those
Mhm.
injuries, sometimes when they're sustained because the event was critical and severe.
Yep.
I mean, we at a younger age, in terms of like just life, are experiencing what we experience. I think people experience when they're 60, 70, 80 years old, but we experience this in 20, 30, 40, 50 years old,
Mhm. Yep.
much, much earlier on.
Yep.
So there's just all of this material
Mm.
to open up deeper conversations. And people do, they do at the campgrounds, they do by, you know, um,
Yep.
fires and boogies and things like that. But I think that when you allow for it to exist in a clinical space where it's just that individual really reflecting on themselves,
Yeah.
you
It
know, you,
deepens us. Yeah. It deepens us.
mm-hmm, absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's why I
Yeah.
wanted to create this place because, I think it was really hard to think just doing this kind of clinical work outside of the sport. I never really figured out how to, sorry, I misspoke. I did figure it out. I previously hadn't figured out, and I was kind of like
Yeah.
chewing on this of like, how do I help people that I care? I care about this community. And as a former social worker, I mean, there is a lot of social work, um, perspective social work, and in these sports, I mean, there's addiction, there's the topics of race and sexuality and all these forms of identification, which I think are really important in the context of what was inherently coming from a very like military-based white environment, right? And we have to acknowledge how that affects people, how that space
Mhm.
feels for different people.
Yeah.
That so there is so much good work that is possible for our community to really tackle on and embrace.
Yeah.
But I wanted to open up this place because it was very increasingly becoming more difficult to reconcile being able to see certain things with the lens that I have
Mhm.
and not knowing how to utter that because you don't necessarily want to walk up to a competitor or a friend or someone on the job zone and be like, hey, that's like
Yeah.
Saturday morning you get a ding, and someone trying to indoctrinate you.
Yes.
I
Yes.
boundaries and respect, right? So
That's a touchy
I,
balance. That it
yeah.
is because
Hmm.
you can often we can see that somebody needs help one way or another. They're
Hmm.
they're wearing their world very heavily,
Hmm.
and you have an insight, a perspective that could change a lot,
Hmm.
but they have to want it.
Hmm.
They
That's
have to
right.
desire it. They have to get to the point of exhaustion, of it's just reaching this point of humble grace
Hmm.
where the light can get in, you
Hmm.
know, and that's one of the hardest things for me is accepting that I can't help everybody because not everybody wants help.
Yeah, I learned that a long time ago because I was a domestic violence counselor for a little over 5 years. And the first year, this was right after grad school. When I say the first year, I also mean the first month of working in the district attorney's office in the South Bronx in New York. I worked for a leading agency called Sanctuary for Families, and my brain is segueing because I really do want to say
Yeah.
this, that I vowed that I would never work for anyone ever again after that because I truly I loved my team. I loved the work that I did. I loved the mission and I was heavily invested up until the point that I wanted to expand. But I was like, after this, I don't want another boss. I don't want another team. If I start something, it'll be just on my own with everything. But I hold them in really high regard. Um, and I had met an individual that was still actively in an abusive relationship. And at the time, and again, right after grad school, and was like 10 years ago, I think, at this point.
Mhm.
Um, 1 month into it, 15 clients. At this point, I have like 35 clients, but 15 clients is a lot for someone right out of school. And they came into my office and they were describing some of the abuse that they were enduring
Mhm.
while after our session having to go back home. And I
Yeah.
remember going out that night and I met up with a friend and it's like 9:30 and I knew that this person's partner was going to come back at 10 o'clock, let's say.
Mhm.
And I was vicariously
Yeah.
living through this person's experience, not recognizing that I was vicariously traumatized by what I was hearing, feeling powerless, and also that I was blurring my own boundaries as a clinician. But I learned this a really long time ago, right? And that was, let's say, 2013 or 14, I think, something like
Yeah.
that. But in
Mhm.
2008, when I first started this work, the same thing had happened on a much more visceral level. I was 19 in 2018, so
Wow. Yeah.
Yeah. And that's when I started this work. And I got affected by a woman who'd come in. This is again 2008. I was a sexual assault crisis advocate. So essentially, I was the only person in in a hospital setting, the ER, both
Yeah.
Bellevue and NYU,
Hmm.
that just wore regular civilian clothing. So I mean, we had
Hmm.
SVU, we had NYPD, doctors, because when and this is hours after you know a sexual assault would actually occur, and I would be on call. So I would show up. It would be 2 o'clock in the morning, 4 o'clock in the morning. It's on call for a certain period of time. This is right after college. Now I'm
Oh,
backtracking.
wow.
And this woman had, I had very little skills. I had gone through a 3 month training, but I was also 19 and I didn't have a lot of skills. And so I kind of got thrown into this place where um,
Yeah.
I think that because she was so escalated, so activated,
Hmm.
and her
Hmm.
fight or flight was, I mean, I couldn't, I felt that there was nothing that I was able to do. I tried everything to get her to calm down, but there
Yeah.
was nothing I was able to do. And I think I got really affected by that for years, up until I got into this other position. I'm in 2008, 9, 10, 11, 12, about 4 or 5 years later,
Yeah.
you know. And so
Wow.
when you're doing this work, boundaries have to be down pat, you
Mm.
know. And
Mm.
now I'm at the place where, I mean, it's just, I've seen a lot of work. I've walked next to so many different types of people, so many different types of circumstances. And at this point, I think that, the skill sets and the science and the art, um, a good clinician really defaults back to that. And if you
Mm.
know that you have those things and you can walk with a person, because after seeing so many people actually find healing,
Mhm.
um, I think the trust in human resilience is just
Mhm.
very much appreciated. And I've seen it. I've seen what happens when people engage in this kind of work. So I
Yeah.
trust that. And even in domestic violence work, I was able to
Mm.
be a lot more laid back and sort of like hold that space.
Yeah.
Um,
Hmm.
yeah.
If I might, I feel like there's really two things that have to be considered. On one hand, there is your own self-protection so that you don't, like you erase the board with the chalkboard and you end up with stuff all over you. So teachers
It's a good
clean
analogy.
themselves off.
Yeah.
So you need to go home and be a happy human being. Otherwise, what do
Hmm.
you have to give, right? A hungry farmer feeds nobody.
Hmm.
Right. So
Hmm.
there's the heal the healer piece. And the other part is meeting them where they are, being actually
Hmm.
compassionate, not just saying the words of compassion,
Hmm.
you know. I mean, you can touch somebody like really, in your heart, meeting their heart where they are, because you're unafraid, because
Right.
you know your own resilience, because you know
Right.
your own identity, and you know the well-being of the human consciousness, and the
Hmm.
ability to become, to remain buoyant,
Hmm.
despite the fact that right now you're at the point where the ball's
Hmm.
been pushed underwater and you can't see the light of day. But
Hmm.
you know so I feel like there's really two things, an ebb and flow of that at all times, right?
Hmm. Can you imagine an AFF instructor being reactive with
Mm.
every single, sometimes you have to. Sometimes you have to know that that person is honestly ill-equipped because they are too activated and they're not focused. That's actually, but that's still using your expertise. That's still
Mhm.
using your
Mhm.
eagle's eye, your,
Mhm.
you know, all of the experience kind of perched upwards, sort of being able to take a full inventory of who you're working with and how much they're capable of in the moment. But you're raising such a good point, because I had an agenda when I was 19 for that woman.
Mhm.
And I had an agenda for that other person that other woman when I was, you know, freshly into the DA's office as a domestic violence counselor.
Mm.
The agenda was, I want you to be okay. You need to be okay.
Mm.
But that's not the work. And so all
Yeah.
of my clients, when they come in, they actually have that agenda for themselves. And we have to deconstruct that to say, no, we have to sit and just observe and just accept that this is exactly where you're at. Because if you do that and you spend enough time paying attention to how much pain you're in,
Mhm.
number one, you're holding space. Well, what happens is that that observation is bound to lead to an opinion.
Yeah.
Organically, you're going to figure out that you need something else. Our emotions, when we emote, we're emoting not one or two emotions at a time. We're emoting more than 8, more than 10 at any given time. It is constantly changing, like a kaleidoscope, when you're changing things around and moving it around, and you're looking at the lens and stuff. It's constantly changing. And so because emotions exist on a spectrum, they're never the same from moment to moment. And so when you give yourself the grace and the space to observe that, naturally you can also observe the change within yourself. So I just sit with that person in the moment, or at least try to model that, because
Mhm.
you're right. I do trust in human resilience. I know it's factual. It is biological,
Mhm.
right? It's this is how we've gotten to survive so many years.
Yeah. But some of
Mhm.
the survival mechanisms are, sort of bypassed and short circuited by the mind, by the repeating
Mhm.
thoughts that continue that cycle of the helplessness and hopelessness and
Mhm.
vilification, right? Where we're losing our own power because we're blaming everything on the world or somebody else,
Mhm.
and the empowerment dissolves, and that can go on all the way to the terminal point of a person's life, can it?
Sure. Sure. Yeah. Oh, you are bringing up something that so we've adapted, I think, socially to taking on some norms that are, I think, toxic. Gabor Mate, going back to this, actually, this is what you're bringing up, and I was listening to a podcast that he was doing, actually, um, and he has this brand new book that is phenomenal, must read. Can look it up actually when we're done, the appropriate title. But it needs to be on people's bookshelves, I think. I have some things like The Body Keeps a Score,
Mhm.
being a very important book
Does.
for all of us, right? So I hold it, and I think a lot of us hold it to that regard, because it's very important. It's an important work, um, and a compilation of many different complex ideas. And one of these ideas, like the theme, sorry, the thesis of the book itself, is that we live in a world that we've normalized, um, ideologies that have become toxic, but because they're normalized, we don't necessarily know how to differentiate between our animalistic, um, organic, authentic selves and what we actually have been told is just the way,
Mhm.
right? And I know that I might be articulate here, but I'm butchering it because it's explained so much more in
Mhm.
depth in his work. But
Yep.
the reason I'm bringing this up is because even from before this publication, went out, this is the lens that I have as well for my clients, that you have to be able to understand what a person understands of the world first.
Mhm. Yeah.
you know um
Mhm.
take this other idea, I think, for example, two siblings with the same parents. Both of those siblings do not have the same parents. They
Yeah.
can't.
Right. Because the parent is here. There's data, but it's interpreted in a certain way, a very specific, unique way, which means that everybody's in a different world.
And the parent, when that first child was 5, is also in a different space as a
Also true.
person
Also
than
true.
when the other child is 5.
Absolutely.
So it's such an individual. It's so important to understand how a person sees the world first before you start tampering and touching everything. So I tell my clients, hands up.
Hmm.
Whenever the
Hmm.
somatically, whenever their sympathetic nervous system starts coming up, their eyes are dilated, their breathing changes, their heart rates change, they start
Yeah.
getting hot and sweaty, they start talking really fast, the rigidity in the body, all of those markers, when that stuff comes up, you take a deep breath in and
Hmm.
allow for that to stabilize you, because hands up, don't try to fix anything, right? You need to listen, you need to hear it.
Yep.
And that translates onto drop zones, it translates onto, exit points, everything.
Yep. The grace of not knowing is what I call that, so that you can know what the truth is. You can't show up expecting that you already know
Mm-hmm.
it. And that's an uncomfortable place for us. We want to fill content. We want to fill in the blanks at the end, and
Yeah.
be done with our judgments. And
Mm-hmm.
that's the trouble with judgment in general, I believe, is that it wants this quick thing to happen so that you can move on to the next thing. But truth isn't like that. It requires a quiet observer that's patient,
Mm-hmm.
that doesn't actually come to a conclusion,
Mm-hmm.
right? To an absolute conclusion about, in this case, another human being. It's impossible, and it's not your job.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's all this stuff that we show up with, therapeutic aggression, where we have our own beliefs and we find ourselves saying, I don't think it's such a good idea, that you want to get into a three-way relationship when you've been married for 17 years. And, there's lots of things where we have our own judgments,
Mm-hmm.
right or wrong. There's no such thing really. And from a certain perspective, maybe
Mm-hmm.
from another perspective, there is a right and wrong, but
Mm-hmm.
either way, to be the really impartial observer that is truly loving,
Mm-hmm.
the loving observer just listens and accepts and
Mm-hmm.
points their attention in a direction that is a little bit more uplifting at every point. That's,
Yeah.
you know,
When I was in college, I took a class on different modalities, different therapeutic approaches, and it was like a psychotherapy modality class or whatever, and or like theories of psychotherapy. I think that's actually what I think it was called. And I think that's what the textbook was called. But there was, there's this approach of unconditional positive regard that is an option for clinicians. You can approach your client unconditionally, positively regarding everything that you're holding, everything that all of the things that a person brings into the therapeutic space are both welcome and also understood. Um, but I think that there is a very important distinction to be made between compassion
mm,
and safety.
mm,
And so what you are bringing in is how important, I think where we've both landed and what you just added is how important it is to understand the individual, right? So if, there is, I think you brought up polyamory, or I'll bring up base jumping, for example. I
I
want
know.
to learn, I
Perfect.
want to start base jumping right now. This is what I want to
Yeah.
do. I
Yeah.
don't know why, or I know what I think I know why. I know why. I'm going to do that, right? And this is what I'm going to, or swooping,
Yeah.
which I actually am very passionate about, but I think I also had to do the same work.
Yep.
Um, why does anyone want to do anything at any given time ever?
Mm,
Right? That space for introspection
mhm,
is sometimes I think easier when you're kicking ideas back and forth with one another. I think it's possible through journaling or through sitting down and actually creating some space intentionally to think about these things.
yep.
But it's something that's so important. But the delineation we need to make between, having this autonomy to do whatever it is that you're compelled to do by way of either understanding it or maybe even not understanding it, but you're doing it because you have the right,
Mhm,
technically. If someone's being hurt or harmed or is engaging in a process that in the short term might give them
yeah.
comfort, might give them a sense of confidence, or uh, touches on those feel good principles, you know, in the long run, if it actually is negatively impacting or maladaptively impacting their lives to connect with other people or to engage productively in construction in their life where they're constantly gaining construction, they're growing,
Hmm.
or quite literally degrading their bodies to a point where, we're now looking at like substance abuse and misuse, right?
Hmm.
And we can be addicted to anything, not just,
Yep.
obviously I'm speaking to, but we can be addicted to extreme sports. We can be addicted to sex and food and TV and anything really, not just drugs and alcohol, but certainly that too. So, you have to be able to ask yourself, uh, am I spending the time intentionally to think about why I'm doing anything at any given time ever?
Hmm.
you know,
Right.
and then when you get to that place, then that's when you have authenticity.
Yeah, I'm with you.
Hmm.
Yeah, to have the larger awareness.
Hmm.
And as the observer, we certainly do have our judgments that show up in our minds about what is good and what is bad, in that black and white sort of mentality, but it's not really true, is it? There is their perspective, there's your perspective, and then there's another perspective too.
Hmm.
And
Hmm.
for me, that's as a coach, because I made a choice to go in the direction of life coach as opposed to a clinician,
Hmm.
where I'm in any kind of a mainstream modality. Um, I I find that if I can show up with an open mind, but a constructive intention
Hmm.
to view the person not just as they are, but the person they're evolving into,
Hmm.
the happier, more balanced, more
Who decides that?
productive, that's them. That's their
Hmm.
job, right? And so you get them to speak it.
Hmm.
you
Hmm.
know so you ask the questions, and in my experience, that's what I do is, so what would be cooler than this? And I can't tell them what it is because it's their life, it's their trip,
Hmm.
you
Hmm.
know and so to be the nurturer
Hmm.
of expansion from their own perspective, to get them dreaming and wondering
Hmm.
of what would be better and more, sort of the next step. What's the next step for me, for
Hmm.
my soul, for my expansion?
Hmm.
Because I can't give it to the individual. That's not my job. It's not your job.
Hmm. Hmm. So I employ some clinicians as well under me because the way that it works is you have the licensed clinical social worker LCSW license, and underneath that is the licensed master social worker LMSW, and
Hmm.
then you have master social workers, the MSW.
Hmm.
So we essentially in our profession have two licenses, and I have LMSWs that work that I supervise underneath me for a couple of reasons. One, because there's just a high demand in the practice and I can't get physically to everybody, but also um, to allow for those individuals that I might have a closer degree of connection to. I don't see anyone in my practice that I have like a 1 degree separation from. That's usually when I refer out or, and a lot of people do come to me, wanting to speak and wanting to work directly with me and um, without going off on a tangent because that's not where I'm going. We have protocols to try to figure out what's appropriate and what's not. So boundaries are incredibly important. But what I am trying to get to in this point is the LMSW, one of the LMSWs that works with us at Alta Therapy, brought up this exact topic, and she was frustrated because she was trying to reconcile how she should hold, like how she should show up as a clinician when we go to school, we read books, we have our practice, we believe in our practice, but we also learn about whether there are modalities or whether it's diagnostics or tools, treatment models, all of these things. When do you start using the items that you know on your tool belt, and
Hmm.
when do you allow for the expertise of the individual? And that's actually there's a balance, right? But the way
Hmm.
that I answer that, because I do actually think it's important that if someone who is trained and someone who is going to commit themselves to doing this work, imagine if you went to a doctor and that doctor gave you no recommendations basing off of your diagnosis of um, high blood pressure, right?
Hmm.
They gave you they did not tell you that basing off of literature and experience and evidence that the likelihood of continuing to eat fried food or the likelihood of continuing to work 12 to 16 hours
Hmm.
would put you biologically in a position that would only exacerbate the symptoms, right?
Hmm.
So there is a balance because we do, as clinicians, as uh, experts of trauma because we've
Mhm.
studied it, and the expectation is that, to do this work, you also have to take the work seriously, and you have to take the information that you're disseminating seriously and with respect, because that's actually the thing that helps people too.
Yeah.
So that's where you come up with the art, because
Mhm.
there has to be um, a moment where the clinician does step in and through modeling shows that, hey,
Mhm.
boundary here.
Mhm.
It seems to me that you're engaging in, this kind of like repetitive hard partying. And what we know is that avoidant behavior or pain unaddressed will come out in certain ways, whether that's anxious driven behavior
Mhm.
or that's engaging in behaviors that are only going to perpetuate the same kind of pain,
Mhm.
right?
Yep.
So, what I see basing off of what I know from what I do and have been doing is X, Y, and Z. And then you just leave it there. And then how a person picks it up is up to them, right? But we have to step in and be educators
Mhm.
as well.
Absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
Yep, absolutely. I think that there is a perspective that we can share when we're
Mm-hmm.
just, you show up and you go, I'm the light. I'm the light of awareness. I'm the mirror of
Mm-hmm.
what I'm getting, so that you
Yeah.
can see, sort of who they're being in that moment.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm not just a mirror. I'm a mirror that sort of tilts up towards the version of them that's becoming. And maybe it's not here and now,
Mm-hmm.
when you're mad, you can't see what it's going to feel like to be resolved in that anger. When you're
Sure.
sad, you can't quite
Sure.
yet, you're immersed in it. And I think that's where the loving mirror comes in. That's the job. That's the work. But in the long run, it's about, I think, giving them skills so they don't need me. I don't want to create an addiction to me or to
A
therapy
dependency.
in
Yeah.
general. Right.
So the therapeutic relationship should be co-regulation in the name of co-regulation, but it's not effective. Therapy no longer becomes effective if co-regulation exists only in the therapeutic space 45 minutes per week, and that person is not taught or not exploring ways of regulating themselves outside of therapy. So
Mm.
there is a very important point about psychotherapy that I think needs to be made here, because the expectation of therapy being a place that you just go to and that's where and when you feel in your week
Mm-hmm.
is only going to limit the growth and the process. That person actually does need to be assigned certain pieces of homework, right?
Mm-hmm.
I always assign homework. All my clients have journals. Every single client. It doesn't matter what you do and
Mm-hmm.
who you are, right? We
Yep.
have to be able to capture what it is that you're saying in real time and get it down on paper
Yep.
and then do something with it later, because without behavioral change, there's nothing to compare a previous system to. So there's no
Mm-hmm.
introspection. We can't just go in and mode and vent. And this is kind of where um I think I gain a lot of the like popularity because the idea um, of, oh, well, I'm just going to feel my feelings, right? No, that's not going to work.
Mm-hmm.
You don't just feel your
Mm-hmm.
feelings. You have to learn how to decipher your feelings. That
Mm-hmm.
it's a kind of code, and it's telling you, going back to the instrument. So we have to learn how to do that. And because language has been created, it's also socially constructed.
Mm-hmm.
It differs. These words differ from country to country,
Yep.
from geographical location, in
Yeah.
family systems. So we
Mm-hmm.
have to really appreciate language and what that actually means for us as individuals, and then be able to use it so that way we're articulating. We don't, maybe in 45 billion years, we'll work telepathically and stuff, but this is what we got right now.
I don't
You
think
know,
it's going to take that long.
you don't think it's going to take that long for
No.
people to stop using language?
Oh no, stopping is one thing, but I think that we're going to see that it was already there.
Yeah, yeah,
When when we look at it in an empathic relationship, for instance, when you're sitting with your client,
sure.
you could say, well, I'm hearing their words, but I'm seeing their body language,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
But I'm also feeling their energy. I'm feeling the EM field.
Oh
Uh,
gosh, I
Some
would
people
love
see
if we
their
all just learned that.
colors. So there's more
Yeah.
going on
Yeah.
that was always going on. It's just
Hmm.
that we were taught that it's only, words and actions, and that's all there is.
Right, right, right. Yeah, there is a way for the psychological model and the medical model to meet. And when we really understand that a lot of this has to do with neurochemistry, a lot of it has to do with biology,
Mhm.
you know,
And more.
and more for sure. Yeah, I love going into the places where I'm asking people, all walks of life, about their spirituality, their relationship, their religiosity. All of these things are actually incredibly important. Whether they exist in one form or another
Mhm.
depends on the person. And so that's why, again, I hang back and just allow for whatever to come out
Right.
to present itself. But I think it's so important. Yeah. Hmm.
Yep. Now with trauma, right? Because that's your area of focus.
Hmm.
Um, timeline. Timeline to feel like someone has really changed their perspective, that they've
Hmm.
unloaded a burden to a sufficient degree. It's
Hmm.
always there.
Hmm.
You know how to play that role. You know what I
Yeah.
mean? You've practiced it for 20 years or 30 years to have that pattern recognition response. So you have a skill, if you will, a skill set in how to play that role if you choose to. But the point at which, and I know it varies from individual to individual, and some people will hang on to it, and you're never going to get it done, which is sad. But that's in my experience, that's the exception, not the rule. That people can and have had a very short timeline through an insight that really reached them, not just something that you said, but something that was triggered within the individual, where they realize, I had this experience, but I'm not that person anymore.
Mm-hmm.
That it's over and I'm in the here and now. And yes, I will snap back. But if I can release that with, a grace, when I can just go, I know I feel it again. It's very familiar.
Mm-hmm.
That image of, the ground coming up when
Mm-hmm.
you've hooked in. Let's be specific, right? If skydivers
Mm-hmm.
are going to be on the call, right?
Mm-hmm.
You have that experience, you know what it looks like, you have a pattern recognition that's going to cause you to brace for impact, that's going to go into a helplessness, not a
Mm-hmm.
survival, mechanism that's going to actually improve your safety, make it come out differently.
That it's not going to do that. You're saying that you're going to mm-hmm.
Right. So in other words, that moment, the lively awareness within the present moment, that seed
Mm-hmm.
planted, in my experience, people can go from this place of really, really stuck
Mm-hmm.
in an automatics, go straight towards, a negative experience and a repeat
Mm-hmm.
experience, a marker.
Mm-hmm.
In different modalities, there's lots of different things that I've observed with programming, call it,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. A conditioned response. Mm-hmm.
in within the
Or an
mind.
adaptive response, an adaptive response, because you're adapting to having factored in that that's a possibility. I can hook in, I can actually get hurt here. So you're adapting, right? You're essentially trying to fix by having those you know those nervous system responses.
Yeah,
um
yeah,
the idea, whether that's freeze, fight, or flight,
yeah,
fawn doesn't really play here in
yeah.
skydiving, but freeze for sure. Or flight can be I've checked out,
I
a
I think
dissociation, if you will.
I think
It's
they
the
all show
idea
up.
that uh,
I think they all
what
show up.
they do all, yeah, yeah. I mean, uh, they're all adaptive responses in the sense that it's a
Mhm.
person still trying to respond to what is a threat, but it doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to help them, right?
It's
And
just what
so,
occurred. It's what occurred at the time.
yeah, well, I think so. When it comes to this particular kind of trauma,
Mm.
it's important, I think, to recognize that there are things that a person can do, but it's up to that person to figure out what's number one going to work for them. Everything's subjective. But if
Mm.
I have, I'm going to use myself as an example because I, when I think I was on like a third or fourth jump of the day, the winds had shifted,
Mhm.
and I'm usually at Skydive Sebastian, and the winds had shifted. We were going north, and I was gonna go, towards the pond, and I was gonna work on just a 90-degree inducing speed, you know, landing. And as they shifted, I ended up getting pushed
Mhm.
on my base leg. So I
Mhm.
missed the pond and I was going over the ditch. And
Mhm.
instead of going in, crabbing at least as much as I could towards the northeast, as much as I possibly could, because it was no longer north. It was kind of going towards the east. And as I was doing that, instead, since I didn't really have the wherewithal very quickly and the experience, I think to know that, oh, when I land north, when I'm landing at the pond, and specific spatially, like what I'm looking at, my sight picture, and then also things moving really fast. Instead, I turned towards the west, and now I am doing a downwinder,
Yeah.
right? And so it was great. It was amazing. I was like, oh, this is amazing, up until I realized that, the speed that I had induced, and I was going much quicker than I was accustomed to, right? Because I induced speed, I did 90, so I'm already going fast. And it popped me up all the way up about like 35 feet, and I was in a full flare, and I hit the ground, right?
Ow.
Yeah. And I sustained, going back to trauma, um, flashbacks, um,
Yep.
random tears,
Yep.
um, avoidance for a couple of days, but it lasted about 4 or 5 days, and it wasn't even a critical or serious injury. I still have some scars, right? But I mean, I was
Mhm.
arguably in our sport fine.
It could have been worse.
It could have been worse. The point that I'm making is not that I'm turning on myself, because it actually was significant for me,
Mhm.
but it was that in our sport, there are things that happen on a much greater, more severe scale. And if we can get affected by something uh, of that caliber, right, in terms of injury, just imagine how much more comes up for us when we're actually faced with mortality. And I remember,
Mhm.
being in a full flare, I mean, I probably had 3 or 4 inches left of my toggles. Like I didn't have anything. It was kind of up to here. And I knew not to move, so I held it. And Kurt Bartholomew actually came up to me, and he's like, well, whatever breaks you had left, you still held it. And, you know, good on you for remaining cognizant. And
Mhm.
that's the interesting thing, that in all of us, like I think if you ask anyone who has gone into an accident,
Mhm.
an incident of some sort, an accident, what we're capable of thinking about, because neurons are firing so fast. We're having so many different thoughts. And
Mhm.
I've had a similar kind of experience when I was wingsuiting as well. You're able to think about 4 or 5 different things.
Mhm.
Did I really need to buy this suit? Why am I getting this suit? Why this? I don't know. So if I get down, and all of a sudden I have to safety plan. So we're moving so fast in our thoughts.
Mhm.
And we still have, going back to resilience, the ability
Mhm.
to try our very best. But then there are some times where we freeze and we don't know what to do. So in
Mhm.
my case, I knew that I had but so much flair, and I was going to hold it, and I was able, because the only thing I was really able to do was have a conversation with myself. I knew that I didn't have any other options. I'd exhausted all of my options. You're just sitting there, metaphorically sitting, well, literally, actually. You're hanging there, fully in acceptance of what is going to happen, knowing that there is nothing at all you can do. And anything else that you would do further would only make it worse. So you're
Mhm.
watching the ground come up.
Mhm.
And I had to accept that. And, obviously PLF, and, left with some bruising and scars and things like that. But it was more the psychological impact, I think, that happened afterward.
Mhm.
And
Yep.
there's that's an important component when one individual comes to a therapy session. The first thing is, how did you respond in the moment?
Mhm.
Did you freeze? Because I know that I was fully cognizant. I didn't necessarily freeze. I had to accept,
Mhm.
right? And that's a different conversation. So an individual that comes into therapy wanting to speak about, you know, having a hard impact on the ground on landing, we have to understand how many jumps, how much is their exposure,
Mm-hmm.
how acclimated and how habituated are they to all of the stimuli that's coming up for them. Because if I might have been able to have, you know, several thoughts in my mind and also say, well, sheesh, like this is it. Like that, I can't do anything else other than be right here and that, you know, rather than I don't really know what to do, you know.
Mm-hmm.
But there
Mm-hmm.
are the people that will let up.
Yep.
And we have to be able to break down a person's experience and really be able to understand, you know, all of the variables that have come up for that person in order to be able to address all of the minutia for that individual to then create like a treatment plan. I cringe when I say that because I'm not treating people.
It's a
I'm
new
talking
plan. It's a new plan.
a new plan, a new plan. Yeah,
A
an
new
action.
dream. A new dream.
Yeah, I think action plan, I think makes sense because, you know, we have to be able to say, okay, well, so what exactly happened psychologically? Okay, so you ended up freezing, you forgot all your steps, or an AFF student, level 3 or something, and they don't pull.
Yeah.
They just don't pull. They completely dissociate. They have no idea what's going on.
Mm-hmm.
And then the instructor has to pull for them. They end up, you know, failing that level. They have to retake it. Why did that happen? What's happening with this individual on a neurological level or an emotional, psychological, and somatic level that's causing that person to not respond appropriately or in a way that's helping themselves,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Mm-hmm.
So, you know, you break it down and then being tasked as a clinician to go back and to work with exposure therapy, gradual exposure therapy. And I am very careful to say this because what I don't want is someone without clinical experience believing that exposure therapy is like uh, a, a, a course that anyone can take. You have to be able to know when someone is being triggered, you know, to gradually expose them to something where, okay, we're just going to walk it through. AFF level instructors, AFF instructors or AFI instructors. Is it AFI?
AFFI, yeah.
AFFI. Okay. So, you know, they're good with this because that's why we have ground school. We go, okay, let's walk it out. Let's talk it out. We're going into the debriefing room. Like an excellent instructor is going to talk to a student on the ground. That's why, you know, we do our practice touches, 10 or 15 reps of them, you
Mm-hmm.
know, on the ground. That's a form of exposure therapy, right? You're exposing or exposing exposure and
Mm-hmm.
conditioning,
Mm-hmm.
right? The mind and body connection. But when someone has sustained trauma, there's also a lot more consideration in how you can integrate that as part of the action plan or as part of the therapeutic approach.
Yep.
So
Yep.
yeah,
Yeah.
comprehensive work.
Yeah. And rewinding that same scenario to the place, so there's the impact point, and
Hmm.
then just before the impact point, the absolute, abject fear, helplessness, and bracing
Hmm.
for impact or whatever that is, that obviously, was the last thought before somebody got hurt. Because if your thought was, let's make this a graceful PLF, I
Hmm.
got this. This is going to be fun. That's a completely different outcome than the person that gets self-aggressive, saturated in
Right. Yeah.
self-hatred that you screwed up. Right. So to rewind to that point and have a different repeated image in your mind, repeated again and again. I
Yeah.
see this. I'm in deep brakes. I'm low in airspeed. I can't make this a stand up, but I can make it fun. you know, and roll it out. And then I rewind further back and go, all right, that decision point where I find myself side sliding in a crosswind
Hmm.
scenario and I'm headed towards a ditch. Well,
Hmm.
what could I do? What
Hmm.
if I really saw in my mind, this is the wind line. That's where the river is
Yeah.
going. And I got to swim up the river.
Right. Right.
How do I do that in a way that is graceful and smooth and not pressing and rushed and late? But
Hmm.
lots of time and lots of grace. And I got this piece of cake where it
Hmm.
actually ends up tippy toe landing, just kind of a weird process. you
Hmm.
know, I think that's vital is to go through that visualization again and again and again, and role play in your mind. That dream is a precursor to your future,
Mhm. Think
as
about how that,
is the crash one,
yeah,
the crash
right, right.
repeated. You're increasing the likelihood of that happening.
Right, right. And going back to domestic violence work, or going back to toxic relationships, think about how metaphorical our sports can
Yep.
be and are for the
Mhm.
rest of life, right? And
Yep.
so if we don't debrief and we don't sit there and say, what can I take from this? What points of growth from, I can use this as constructively as experience, right?
Mhm.
Then you are going towards the familiar pain patterns
Yep.
in a relationship, whether that be romantic or work or anything that involves you interacting with someone else. In these sports, you're interacting with yourself and you have your wing, and that's
Yep.
a relationship in and of itself. I have a relationship with my katana. We don't always get along, but especially on opening, but it's fine. Um,
I might
but
be able to help with that. We can talk.
okay. but but yeah, so it's a relationship. It's a relationship with your motorcycle. It's a relationship
Mhm.
with anything, with your dive gear, or with your mother, or with your husband, or your girlfriend, boyfriend, boss, etc. And so, if we are not debriefing and not breaking things down to see things as opportunities rather than that was a bad thing that happened. I don't want bad things to happen to me ever again, but I'm not going to go there and talk about it.
Mhm.
I don't know how much work a
Yep.
person is really doing there, right?
No change. It's
Hmm.
just going to
Right.
be a repeater.
Yeah.
Yep. I see a lot of repeaters in this sport, the same
Right.
stereotypical experiences. And I think that's one of the places where I'd like this thought to go in general about trauma, is to rewind out of it and realize, yes, it is your trauma. You personally went through this,
Hmm.
and you can feel it.
Hmm.
It's just a horrible sensation, but it's not only yours.
Hmm.
When you zoom up out of it, how many
Hmm.
other people have gone through this?
Hmm.
The same set of emotions,
Hmm.
the same kind of circumstance that you're experiencing. To
Hmm.
zoom out of it and see that we're all part of something here. We're
Hmm.
part of a learning. We're part of a
Hmm.
learning of how to do things and how to not do things. And that's a beautiful thing, because we don't find our way in this world by getting lucky all the time and having an easy time of it. We
In my
learn
experience,
through experiences.
the barrier here though is that a constructed version of who I came here to be or who I need to be.
Hmm.
That future version, right? That's the ego.
Hmm. Oh,
And
well, we can get into a longer conversation about what ego is, because that means something different to different people. But
sure, sure, sure. Yes, I agree. And there's also this, you know, uh, right, right. Like ego does not necessarily mean conceited and I'm egoic and it's
that's a
it's the way.
whole that's a whole other hour and a half.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. You're right, you're right. But just the way that I've understood myself, right?
Hmm.
And what stops people, I think, from speaking out loud about what they've experienced, from a mishap in skydiving,
Yeah.
at any degree, is that it comes up directly up against this idea of who they need to be.
Hmm.
And that shame or that embarrassment or this sort of like absorbed norm that, yeah, but did you die? Or, all right, yeah, but it's like, come on, we all go through it. Like, you're going to be fine. Like, you can talk to me, etc. But it's really important to understand that that person is going through this experience where they're exposed, their vulnerability. That's a vulnerable place.
Hmm.
It's a very vulnerable place. And in order for someone to really do that kind of work, the work that we're describing here, it's
Hmm.
necessary, I think, to shine the light on this secondary process, this protective part of you is going to say that you don't need the help and that you shouldn't talk about it out loud. You should have known better. You went to school for this, didn't you? You took these classes. You went up to level 8 and level 25, and you have your B or your C or your D license. Shouldn't you know better? Right? And so we put all this pressure on ourselves
Hmm.
that we should have already been doing the correct thing
Hmm. Hmm.
because who we are is like who we need to be is like this badass kind of person. I mean, that's a tall order. It's not realistic. And so that
Shame.
stops people from actually talking
Shame.
and allowing themselves to be vulnerable.
Yep. Of course, we're not only trying to open up the vulnerability of a
Hmm.
human being. We're trying to build the power of an
Hmm.
individual to be able to go into situations and go,
Hmm.
I am the rising tide. I make things better. All boats rise with the rising tide, and that's who I am. I am positive intention, and I will solve problems, and I believe in myself, and that is my identity. It is my
Hmm.
value to the
Hmm.
world. And when people tap into that stuff, the past stuff was just previous attempts, at success. And I learned something about how to not do something. And in that reframing, the suffering that comes from the repeated belief that things are just going to be like that again, it's just going to keep happening.
Hmm.
It gets very heavy for people when they get stuck in it. And
Hmm.
that's why I think it's important to remember that our job is not only to open them up and perform surgery sometimes in terms of the mind and the thought processes and the micro level, but the
Hmm.
bigger picture of who you are. Have you
Hmm.
forgotten the fact that you're not dead? Do you have any idea how much that proves about you?
Hmm. Hmm.
About your model, about your power, about your resilience, about your insights?
Hmm.
That you don't need somebody else to hold you by the hand. You just have to tap into the emotion
Hmm.
of how powerful you are and how brilliant you are. And
Hmm.
then all that stuff, all that self-traumatizing thought process and all those beliefs that because you've gone through something horrible means that you always have it with you.
Hmm.
Yeah, in your library of your memories, sure, but it doesn't have to be part of your now moment. What
Hmm.
has to be in your now moment is your presence.
Mm. I would challenge that to say that that's not a singular path. And I think that when it comes to grief,
Mhm.
there are many processes that repeat themselves that go back and forth. You know, we don't just go towards acceptance and
Mhm.
we can go back into anger or denial or depression or bargaining.
Sure.
And there is a grief that happens when there is grieving that happens when you've watched yourself get very close to death, and there is grieving that happens when
Mhm.
you watch,
Mhm.
your friends go in, or even when, even in something small in comparison, like, you know, not ha- I'm just going to put this just for scale, but not because I'm going to harp on it, but you know, oh, I messed up a jump. That didn't
Mhm.
go the way that I wanted to. That's still a process
Mhm.
of very light, tiny little process of grieving. We have to be aware
Mhm.
of our grieving process.
Mhm.
So for those who have sustained critical injury, who have actually gone to the hospital because of their injury sustained from skydiving,
Mhm.
um, I think that approaching it gently as well, and really leaving space that if they don't feel so powerful, that's okay, right?
In that
And that
moment, in that moment.
knowing that moments change,
Mhm.
but knowing that in the moment, if that's where they're at, it's because that's where their nervous system, that's where their psyche,
Mhm.
that's where their spirit needs to be in order to allow for all of the thoughts and all of the sentiments and regards of themselves to come out. And whether that's about who they are as a person, maybe that got fractured,
Mhm.
and or maybe it's the awareness that we're all very fragile. We could die doing these things, right? That's the whole premise of the activity, isn't it though? And people
Mhm.
kind of forget that,
Mhm.
you
Mhm.
know.
Mhm.
And so when certain circumstances heighten those facts, right? I mean, I think it is much more important to allow for that person to grieve and to feel like they were powerless and to feel all of that stuff, because that's where all of the vulnerable conversations come up about, what we're actually doing and
Mhm.
what are we doing when we do all these things? What is this?
Yeah.
Why
It,
are we
it,
jumping off cliffs? Why are we hurling ourselves towards the earth from an airplane? Right.
perhaps there's different types of physicians that do different parts of the body. And there are different types of helpers with the mind piece, and
Mhm,
some are the specific to uh, in the moment of the
mhm,
pain, in the residual moment, to
mhm,
touch and feel that. And that's their role, because a lot of
mhm,
people are in denial and they don't want to look at it. And that's that piece of the puzzle.
mhm,
And maybe there's other people that
mhm,
go, that sort of pick up after that. Feels
mhm,
like I've ad nausea wrung out the sponge, there's nothing else left. And in my experience, suffering is a never-ending sponge. If you
mhm,
really wring it out, you go, dark night of the soul, we have to live in the dark night of the soul,
mhm.
that'll never end. You know what I mean? And if at some point the person says, all right, I've tapped into it, I know my feeling, I'm just repeating myself, I know the emotion,
But
now
that
I need
happens
to
in therapy as
move on.
well.
Mm-hmm.
Right. That happens in therapy as well. I think it doesn't
Mm-hmm.
necessarily need to be that it's roles are split from provider to provider. I think that that is where it that's where pain gets recycled into something good, like I was talking about before.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a natural process that needs to happen after an organic route gets taken where that person's really sitting with it, rather more so practicing feeling and allowing themselves to decipher what is coming up for them. Because
Mm-hmm.
what will happen is that incident is actually going to bring up a lot of other things. This is actually
Mm-hmm.
why I would never be able to take on someone that I'm separated by 1 or 2 degrees of connection, because
Mm-hmm.
it's never really just about skydiving and getting back on, getting back on that horse and going for a jump.
Right.
It's that is going to drudge up a lot of things. And then when that individual then starts opening up these other doors and starts seeing themselves, their whole self,
Mm-hmm. Yep.
right?
Yep.
After all of that, however long that takes, after all of that, they will naturally get to a place where they are ready for uh, substantive conversations around that recycling and what am I going to do with this now? Now I have a more expansive, expanded purpose. I understand why I'm doing this. I actually have
Mm-hmm.
worked towards authenticity and recovery,
Mm-hmm.
and I've recovered myself, because you lose yourself when it becomes fractured, when a part of your belief system of your who you are gets
Mm-hmm.
taken away, and you're like, wait a minute, I couldn't keep myself safe.
Mm-hmm.
What the heck did I get myself into? Like, why would I start? I got into this so that I can feel powerful. I got into this
Yep.
because no one expects that they're going to have these lessons,
Yep.
when they start their first tandem or something.
Yeah.
And then life
Yeah.
teaches us. And then what you can do with it later still is part of the working relationship. And that can still be a therapeutic process. I have clients that have stayed with me for, going on 3 years, but 2 years as well. Why? Because the work morphs. Your why morphs.
Mm-hmm. Mm.
Mhm.
Mm. Yeah. The forgiveness, the radical forgiveness needs to be a big piece of this process, to forgive
Yep.
yourself for feeling the way you felt, and doing what
Yeah.
you did and experiencing the learning process, to show
Hmm.
you your mind, to show you the gaps in your training, to show you the gaps
Hmm.
in your flowing thought process.
Hmm.
But the forgiveness is a grace of just letting go and go, that's just what was.
Yeah.
It's not what is.
Hmm.
Right. And so I
Hmm.
know that we flip back and forth, sort of indefinitely, especially after specific traumas, but that trauma it got provoked, sure, but it was provoking a part of myself that is my shame, my helplessness, my all those things that everybody's capable of experiencing. But the flipping back, the frequency of how often you go in this direction, as
Hmm.
opposed to whether it's 50-50 miserable and happy,
Is my life
that's the
predicated on
perfect
my
skew.
triggers? If I'm still being triggered, then have I really healed? Right.
Right.
Um, right.
Yep.
Right.
Yep. Our triggers are just a reflection of our own, sort of subconscious thought processes and value judgments and things like that. Yeah.
And our need to return, I think, to also revisit, like, oh wait, my work's not done. I haven't learned fully everything about what I would be able to from that stuff. So sometimes I have clients that come back and they're like, I didn't expect, we've been doing this for 6 months. Why did I go back to drinking?
Mm,
Why did I go back
mm,
to partying that hard? I've been working on this. Don't
mm,
understand. And the first thing I'll tell them is that, what's the number one rule that we have here? We don't turn on ourselves.
mm,
That's coming up because something was actually pressing something
Mhm.
that is probably heavier and um, more complicated, and somehow it found its way at some, maybe the other variables are time and place. Maybe you had gotten to the place in this part of your year that, why don't you take an inventory of all the things you've been going through,
Mhm.
right? Probably a little bit more susceptible to being vulnerable and to going back to those patterns. Or maybe something new happened that it was more weighted, that you
Mhm.
wouldn't be prepared for, because you don't necessarily have, you have the facility to have an action plan for yourself where you're like, okay, well, I understand, how to abstain from alcohol if I needed to, if that's part of it, as an example that I'm giving in most cases.
Yeah.
But when this thing happened, wow, that really just, I mean, and that ends up just deepening and opening up. It's just another level of, having to, I think, exercise even more of the work and going back.
Yep.
Wow, I'm really not over this. Well, maybe, or maybe it's just a matter of understanding where you're at right now, because something is touching on that nerve that wouldn't normally present itself. It's just, it's really got that bad.
Mm. Mm.
You accept it, okay.
Mm.
And then you do the work again, but you have the facilities now. So, or sometimes someone, again, going back to like a sexual assault, that's not something that a person's not, you might go 6 months after not thinking about something like that, or
Mhm.
maybe a year, or maybe after 3 years. Why am I thinking about this 3 years later? The reason is
Mhm.
because when something like this happens to a person, yeah, or they might have gotten the facilities, right? And they might have found healing, but just because a person heals doesn't necessarily mean that they'll never think about what happened ever again. Trauma sometimes comes up because it needs to be, it's like, hey,
Mhm.
you remember we kind of went through that? Can we just remember that that
Mhm.
happened?
Mhm.
I need you to honor
Mhm.
my experience. Like, hey,
Yep.
ego person, can we just honor the fact that that actually really happened? And that could be a revisiting that's actually constructive, because it's grounding in the moment where you're remembering again.
Yep.
But the person then has more coping mechanisms to be able to handle it. So we're going to go back and forth, and it's going to get messy and everything. It's not, nothing is linear.
Mhm. Yep. It's messy and perfect and not wrong.
Hmm.
I think it's important for us to recognize it just was. It wasn't right
Hmm.
or wrong. It's what happened. You were in a car
Hmm.
accident or something
Hmm.
happened that was, you know, you wouldn't want to do it again. And
Hmm.
let's rewind, first of all, into the acceptance of it, but also rewind a little further back to the choice point,
Hmm.
or maybe something different
Hmm.
happen where I
Hmm.
see it a little earlier, right? In the approach, in
Hmm.
the process of being in breaks, and I see that I'm drifting, and in the process of glancing down, I now have an awareness that changes my fate.
Hmm. Hmm.
And I think that's really what's most important is the learning that help us avoid these really deep problems. You're in an
Hmm.
abusive relationship. Well, you had warning signs before you got hit.
Yeah,
You did.
well,
You did. And it's not your fault, but it's also
yeah,
an
I
opportunity in the
think that
future.
yeah.
It's a future. It's a future that you can create where
Hmm.
you're now going to have a little bit better radar for your boundaries and your willingness to accept people,
Hmm.
first words, you're like, nope, red flag, and now that experience. So we get
Hmm.
wiser. We get
Hmm.
wiser and wiser and wiser. Otherwise, the trauma and the experiences are a waste, and
Right,
they're gonna come back
right.
around.
Gradually, we learn gradually. And also the important point to what we are talking about here is that it is not black and white. It's not that I'm going to address this and I'm just going to be better. It's
Mm.
that I'm going to get better at making a landing pattern that is going to, be in my head before I go on the jump. I'm
Mhm.
going to also factor in that my landing pattern is subject to change. It's always should
Yep.
be regarded as something that's always subject to change.
Mhm.
I'm going to, so you create these kinds of rule sets, but then there's, you can't approach that so rigidly as well, because then there's always an opportunity to then shun yourself after when it didn't work, or when you just didn't do it perfectly the second time, because the idea is that we went through it, we should have gotten better. Why didn't we get better? Why did I go back to that person? Why did I go back to her? Why did I go back to him? Or why did I get myself into another relationship like this? Why did I have that same kind of landing? Damn it, I did it again. I messed up my base leg, right?
It doesn't help, right? That like self-punishment. No, no, no.
No,
Early on, recognizing, oh, I'm self-punishing. Stop it.
right. And
And
then,
instead
and
learn.
recognizing that learning is gradual. You're going to make similar mistakes, but you can never, ever, ever, it's impossible to make the exact same mistake. You can't, you literally can't. But what can happen, and I think needs to be understood, because it has to be a gentle process, is that the likelihood of someone making a slightly similar but kind of a more refined mistake is still possible.
I would add that many of our life lessons are gradual learning processes,
Mhm.
many of them.
Yeah.
And many of them are pivotal insights that change us forever in an instant.
Mhm.
I've had both. I've had
Mhm.
many, many, many where I will never make that mistake again. I saw it in that moment and it burned an emotional bookmark in my mind in the moment of heated physiological escalation so that I could remember the way I understand the mind based on my own, research, undergrad and grad school in psychology. I didn't learn nothing. One of the things I learned is that the emotional escalation of the body is directly proportional to the accessibility of the memory in that moment.
Mhm.
And if we learn it
Mhm.
in the hot moment,
Mhm.
now it becomes something that really is lit up in our consciousness and we're
Mhm.
forever changed, and so therapy is not so sexy if we pitch it as, oh, by the way, you're going to be with me for years. You're not going to sell nobody this idea. It's true. If we say, I believe that there's going to be a process that we're going to have a back and forth, and I don't know how long it's going to go. It's going to go as long as you want it to
But
go.
that's the truth. Well, it's also as
Is
long
it?
as, yeah, that is the truth. And so I'll give something that's a little bit, kind of encouraging about something, a substantive fact about learning that might be encouraging for people who have this kind of fear. Well, how long is this going to take? I'm going to sit here and like every week, and I'm gonna have to pay you for it, and I'm gonna have to show up. I have to make time for it.
Mhm.
Realistically, that's actually not how most of my clients just, I mean, they enjoy it. It's a very interactive. It actually kind of feels like this. We're going back and forth and we're talking, and um, that's a stylistic approach that I've chosen, just because I think that it opens people up and it feels more humanistic rather than me hanging back and not saying anything.
Mhm.
Um, but on average, it takes a person about 66 days, evidence-based, there's research around it, to change behavior, provided that that person is engaging in a process of um, intentionally putting forward new behavior and understanding that they have a plan, they stick to it, even while factoring in that there might be some slight regression. Like, damn it, I did eat that cookie.
Mhm.
But if there's recovery right after, with
Mhm.
intention and with a clear plan
Mhm.
and the purpose for behavioral change, to come back to the therapeutic space to talk about how that week has been different than the week prior, about 66 days for one, that's 11, for or two, arguably, for one goal to be changed. And that could just be the door monster, right? You can't expect yourself to to just completely change as a person after 66 days, right? You can't expect yourself to have all this introspection and now I've figured out, the issues with my mother and my father and my brother and my sister and this and that, and I'm also a better skydiver. And that's so we work on one thing that is the most pressing for the person in that moment, and then we quantify it. We also we quantify biological feedback. Obviously, a person doesn't have an EKG, but hey, it's 2023. People have Fitbits, you
Mhm.
know? So how long does it actually take you to de-escalate? What's your respiratory system doing? So I need you to quantify that. I actually use these electronic tools where people are logging a lot of this stuff.
Mhm.
And I call it the daily log, and we look at everything from hygiene, nutrition, socialization, coping mechanisms, food, medication management, or anything really, and self-talk. Um, what kind of self-talk, feelings, cognitions. So this thing tracks everything, and essentially we look at the data after a while, and the idea is that the person's coming back every single week, provided that we've done all of the rudimentary educational tools, we've learned them, so we have a framework, we know how to use them when we need them, and then they go into this space where they're quantifying everything. The idea is that their activation time should decrease,
Mhm.
their grounding, their ability to ground again should speeden up, so that should also decrease. I've been able to ground faster. My accessibility to grounding methods is quicker, right? So there has to be a science behind it, because that's how you're going to measure growth. And around
Mhm.
66 days, with one goal in mind, very, very specific, people do start seeing some differences. I actually see differences after a whole year, after 2 years. I mean, people are just making it's the reason why I'm going to do this until I'm older, because it's just the older, like 80, 90, I don't care, however long, because it's the most beautiful thing to see a human being make major transformations.
Mhm.
Their ideologies, their sense of self, everything is shifting. And about 1 or 2 years of consistently showing up, people do make change. And it's
Mhm.
beautiful to look at, honestly. I'm honored every single time. I always say, like, thank you so much for honoring me with your trust. And uh, I love being able to hold witness to all of it.
Yeah. Yep.
Hmm.
And it's the whole point, isn't it? To be of service,
Hmm.
best that we possibly can with all that we are, because we love the people.
Hmm.
They're us, we're them.
Hmm.
And there's parts of us, in the past, you could call it that, where we were right where they are.
Hmm.
And so in essence, we're helping ourselves, just a past version of ourselves, or maybe even a future version of ourselves again.
Hmm.
But that's, I feel like, where the true compassion comes from. They're not
Yeah,
we're not separate from them, and vice versa.
I agree.
And so I want to thank you for doing what you do.
Yeah.
It's
Thank
not
you
an
for
easy
having
it's
me.
not an easy job, and
Yeah.
it's a necessary job. This world is full of trauma provoking experiences, but that's not wrong. That's just the way it's designed,
Yeah.
so that we can expand, so we
Oh
can
yeah.
grow and learn and experience.
Oh yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah. Well, thank you, Chloe.
Thank
Best
you,
luck with
Brian.
all that you do. I hope that you find more and more and more ways to help. Have a wonderful day.
You too. Thank you.